This is JoCAT, the home of the Creative Arts Therapy Research Community. Welcome to our podcasts. On a recent trip to Europe, Bettina Evans made a special trip to the UK to talk with Robert Macfarlane, a writer who has been a major influence on her creation and inclusion of nature-connected arts therapeutic aspects into the teaching program at Whitecliffe's postgraduate diploma and master's degrees in creative arts therapies. This podcast is quite long, but make sure you listen to the end as Bettina invites Robert to give a reading from his most recent book, which beautifully brings together all the themes that are touched on throughout.
Welcome, Rob. So for this interview, and we're sitting here in Cambridge in this beautiful garden, and maybe you can say a little bit about the tree when we start. And it feels a long way from New Zealand for me because it's the middle of summer here and it's the middle of winter in New Zealand. But as a little overarching or maybe spinning a little thread between here and New Zealand, I thought I'll just say a very brief welcome to you in Maori.
Thank you.
Because
yes.
This is where I live. So now my haere mai, which just means welcome, and I will tell you a little bit about in New Zealand, when Maori people get together and talk to each other and introduce each other, it's called a mihi or mihi for several people, and a pepeha. And the way that people introduce themselves to each other is by mentioning the landmarks that are important to them, or where they were brought up, or where they live. And the name of the person comes at the very end of the introduction. And also the name of all your ancestors and the tribe and the iwi, the hapu, all these different get mentioned before you. So it's a very different way of us Europeans who always introduce ourselves with our name first. Yeah. So I will do this very brief introduction, and in Maori and in a formal setting this would go much longer. I'll just say three things and then I will ask you. So ko aoraki te moanga, ko whakaraupo te moana, ko Bettina to ko inoa. That means Aoraki, Mount Cook, is my mountain. Whakaraupo, Littleton, is my harbour or my water. Bettina is my name.
Wow.
And so I was wondering whether you would like to say a little bit about the mountain that is sacred or special to you, and a little bit about the water that is sacred or special for you as an introduction.
What a beautiful form of greeting and meeting. I'm very moved by that, and I love the lack of egotism, the sense that geography comes before name, before self, or is constitutive of it before the given name. So I suppose my version of that would be something like the Cairngorms, the granite Cairngorms are my mountains, and I suppose I should say that the River Cam, this vulnerable, low, diseased, polluted, fragile river that runs through my home city of Cambridge here, is my water, is my river, and my name is Robert Macfarlane. And I feel I should add a tree to that.
Yes,
because
please.
we're sitting together. Very wonderful to greet you and meet you here and bring you to a tree being that means a great deal to me. I always say one of the most amazing organisms I know. and it's an oriental plane. It's about 215 years old, and it's impossible to evoke in language and an image, but it forms a dome because its boughs come out and drop to the ground and root in again off its elbows, as it were, in a great circle around us. And so we're sitting within the green shade of its immense leaf cover. I mean, there must be hundreds and hundreds of square meters, possibly more than a kilometre square of leaf, let alone the miles of branch that surround us. It's really an extraordinary being. So the plain is my tree.
Yeah. Do you want to say just a little bit why the mountain, this particular mountains in New Zealand are often ancestors?
Yes.
They're often taboo places, but why is which doesn't mean that you can not climb them,
Yep,
but it just
yep.
means that they're precious.
Yes, precious.
So
yes.
why are the cairngorms
precious
to you, or what is it about them?
Well, I sometimes say that my heart is made of mountains, and I guess that geological process happened early for me with my grandparents, my children's ancestors, I suppose, in the sense that they hardly knew them. Lived in the north of the Cairngorms. The Cairngorms is a very old Devonian era massif, former volcano, effectively in the northeast of Scotland. Its mountains are big. They're very set back, and they are effectively Arctic. The summit plateau of the Cairngorms is a tundra.
Yeah.
And has our few Arctic species, dwarf willows and snow buntings and ptarmigan, which you would find, and I've seen in Greenland or in the Canadian Arctic, and really that's where I learned how to walk in and into mountains, and which is knowledge that's shaped my life and my being and my motion since then, I suppose. So, and then the river I've said a little about. I mean, you come, Bettina, we speak on the eve really of what looked set to be record smashing temperatures, heat wave temperatures here in Cambridge. Cambridge holds the record for the hottest place in the United Kingdom ever in recorded history. That was set, I think, 3 years ago, and it looks like that's not just going to be broken, but absolutely smashed on Monday and Tuesday. Very bad news for rivers, especially those that run over chalk. The aquifer is low, the replenishment is low. Our poor river that runs fast and well in the winter is a slow, sluggish thing at the moment. So, memories of a beautiful sort of pure winter place in the form of the mountains, and then of a compromised, threatened Anthropocene place in the form of the river seems true to our moment.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Robert. So, as you know, I'm an art therapist,
Yeah.
so we're going to bring some of your knowledge and my questions together. So, as art therapists, we work with people to regain, discover, or recover a sense of self or selves, because people often come with fractured beings,
Yes.
into
Yes.
therapy. And for many people, nature or being in the natural world or in an environment it's a really helpful thing if people are not well. And in all of your books, you have written about your exploration and immersion into different landscapes. Do you feel that you have explored your sense of self at the same time? How, if at all, do you see the relationship between self and landscape, the landscape of self, or the self as landscape? I know this is a very wide, lofty question, but I don't know. Have you got any thoughts?
Yes, about 2,000 pages of thoughts. Really, probably.
Yes, I know.
All the
I
books
know.
set end to end, but many thoughts. And I should just say to listeners who may be perplexed to hear engine noise hard in the background that we're sitting within the arms of this beautiful tree, but we're also hard by the bus station, and that's where the tree lives, and so you will hear passers by and the noises off from the bus. But well, gosh, I mean, first of all, I think that the work you do as healers, as if not the menders of fractures, at least the openers of paths to places where perhaps new forms of wholeness might be found, if that makes sense, in that when one passes through a trauma, I don't think you can ever perhaps remake the same being as was present before. So it's healing is, in my limited experience of it, is not a perfect recovery of what was. It's the ability perhaps to move forwards, hopefully, into the future. I speak very speculatively here, of course, but
of course,
it's
and
your
I'm not
profession.
and I'm not asking you about art therapy, but about your sense of self and landscape. How for you that, I don't know, do you see yourself in landscape? Do you feel landscape itself.
Yes,
When
I
you
mean,
go out.
I don't really imagine the two as divisible, I suppose. I think it's perhaps, I mean, I dislike the word environment. I
Yes.
try not to use it. I try to use the phrase living world or natural world.
Yeah.
Environment seems to me a sort of fairly chilly, alienating notion of exteriority. I can't really imagine the self being made without reference to the places through which we pass. And I've written in the past about how I see landscape as a kind of noun containing a verb, that idea of the scaping power that we are always being shaped by, and in turn shaping the places we live in and the places we move through. I think I find it very fruitful to think of the idea of certain places as growing certain ways of being, as being habitats for certain thoughts and certain feelings, in the same way that we might say, oh, the bee orchid grows well on the chalk. Under these conditions, we might also say that hope grows well in certain places. W.H. Murray, this glorious mountaineer, mystic, writer who I've touched on and reclimbed some of his winter routes, he says there are certain places where the natural movement of the heart is upwards. And I believe that, but I don't believe that we should prescribe where those places are. They're not a universal panacea, and the geometries and dynamisms of the spirit are heavily acculturated and contextual and so forth. But I do believe that almost everyone will be able to think of at least one place in memory or actuality where they find that the natural movement of the heart is upwards. And I think if we've lost that possibility, then as broadly speaking, if we've kind of eliminated and rendered extinct that possibility of response to place, then we're in even more desperate trouble. So I can't really, in a way, I can't really unweave the idea of self from the idea of place. I've certainly thought with landscape, and to some extent been thought by landscapes. What would my life be without the mountains that I grew up in? I can't imagine it. So, and the same for you, the same for people you work with and speak to. Do you think, does everyone you know have a place where the heart's movement is upwards? Or
I don't think so, and I think that is maybe sometimes one of the things that's really difficult for people, if they maybe have not had the possibility or the privilege to go out and find that place. People who are stuck in the middle of a city and for whatever reason are not able to find the place. And I know that also in cities you can find the green spaces, so it's not the fault of the city, but maybe sometimes people need to have that reawakened, or need to be reminded of that nature is the living world, that the living world is there to engage with.
Yes. Yes, that's a really important distinction, isn't it? That they that people may not yet know that feeling, but that it probably does await them, and that it exceeds forms of acculturation. Though, as we know, there are all sorts of ways in which race and ethnicity and class can make it harder to find forms of release and recovery in nature.
And not everybody feels safe in nature.
Exactly.
There's people that I've worked with who find it really difficult and unsafe to be outside, maybe because they've had experiences in Christchurch with the earthquake, where the earth itself has become dangerous for a certain while, or where people just never were given the opportunity to find the space and the time in an environment that can be so nurturing, but that can be dangerous.
Absolutely. I trustee of this organisation called Action for Conservation, and we work with 12 to 17-year-olds, and we take them out. We take them on summer camps, free summer camps, working mostly often in a city population, so we have very high high proportion of students, young people coming from schools with what we call here pupil premiums. So that's basically where their lunches and meals are being paid for, and there's financial support coming from the government. And we also have a very high non-white ethnicities, a range of ethnicities coming on our camps. Again, nature is often seen as a very kind of white space in the UK, and the conservation in particular is a very white sector, really problematically white. And exactly as you say, it's a case of opening up the Peak District or West Wales or the South Downs, and making these places which feel hospitable and welcoming, and where these kinds of encounters can happen. And when they do happen, as we know, they shape your life, right?
Indeed. I don't know if you've read the book by Nick Lowe, which was called Uprising, the Maori writer that was one of the first Maori people in New Zealand who wrote this book.
Wow.
About mountaineering through the eyes of Maori population.
Amazing.
And
no, how have I not heard of this book?
And because also in New Zealand, most people who have written about mountains have been white people, Pakeha people, whereas Maori people, of course, have crossed the Alps for hundreds of years, but not a lot has been written about it, and the routes that Maori people have walked are very are still there, but you need to know them, and they've had different points of where people could rest, where people could find food, and where often fire making equipment was left behind, or food was left behind, or markers were left behind. But all of that knowledge has gone. But now finally the first books are being written about it, and the knowledge is being shared, so that the mountains are not anymore just to climb a mountain for sport, but also for people to recognize them for what they always were, namely sacred spaces.
Yes.
And that they both are food places, food gathering places, or they were trade routes, but they also have a far wider and deeper.
So would that be the case that then summits are less important, passes are important places?
Aoraki Mount Cook, the tallest mountain in New Zealand, is in Maori mythology one of the most important mountains, because it's the highest, but also because it was three brothers on a waka, on a canoe, who travelled and they got frozen by the winter winds, and they hunched down and got frozen in this place, and have become the three.
They form the peak.
Yes, the peaks. And so in this book, Nick Lowe describes how he has ascended Mount Cook several times, but he has decided not anymore to descend to the top, which is the head of the of this ancestor, and so to stop just below the summit, so to leave the head, which is a very sacred thing, free. And so more tour guides also are doing this, that they don't descend to the very top anymore, but just below.
That's Kailash, Mount Kailash, which is the holy mountain of numerous religions, from which the four of the great rivers flow. Again, is famously off limits, and that prescription has been respected, as I understand it, but even by summit-hungry Western mountaineers earlier in the last century. But I that interests me very much. This intersection of sacredness and beinghood in landscape. This idea that a river might be a being which is second nature to, which is now being, as we've been discussing, is now being sort of rediscovered by Western post-Enlightenment legal frameworks, let's say. But of course, it's been self-evident to much older continuous traditions for much longer than that. Or that a forest might be said to think, or a mountain might be said to remember. And I find in my experience, people in this country are rather embarrassed to talk about these things, but also feel them. So it's almost that we've had the possibility of that familiarity and friendship almost with places knocked out of our discourse, but by rationalism, by scorn, and by the metrics of standard kind of fiscal cost benefit analysis, which just doesn't. There's no column for insolvent.
No, indeed not. And I think it's the same in New Zealand. You know, Ed Hillary, you know, who was the first. Well, I mean, he first climbed Mount Cook before he went, but you know, the famous saying of, you know, we've knocked the bastard off,
yes,
you know,
exactly.
is you know, very much this attitude of conquering rather than honouring.
And conquering,
you know,
rather than honouring.
yes. And so I think there's a lot for us to learn in New Zealand from the Maori as the first people who were there, who were able to see the material of the material world, as in fishing and hunting and living in it, as well as the sacred. And you know, I think as Pakihas, white people, we often forget about the sacredness, as you were saying, you know, also in New Zealand, and there's a lot for us to learn.
Yeah.
Okay, Rob, another couple of questions. So we talked a lot about individuals, but because our age is an age of individuals climbing up a mountain, or individual maybe art therapists, but to create change in this world, we need to work together. And one of the words that we use in expressive art therapy is communitas, which is the being together of people without a hierarchical structure, where people come even together maybe in unstructured ways, and yet they share, you know, a common goal. And I know that you have worked with a lot of other artists, and I wonder what that has meant for you, or what a difference it has made for you to work on your own, because writing, I think, is very much you sit in your room and you write, and it's a very inward sort of a thing. And I know you have said to me you work really hard and slow and go over it again. But then working with others like, you know, Johnny Flynn, where you made music with J.K. Morris, who's a visual artist, and you've been involved with filmmaking. So what has it given to you, this feeling of communitas?
Yeah, it's a lovely phrase, and makes me think of the aspen colony that we were discussing earlier, the world's biggest organism, and the tree, which is actually hard to distinguish from many organisms. And the tree we're sitting under is also, as we were discussing, a hard being to speak of as a single being, but really it's a community, because the woodpeckers live in the hole that they've made in the bough over there, and the wood pigeons nest just up there, and humans come, and I teach my students under here, you know. So it seems a good place to be talking about communitas. And I think as a writer, I was a bit of a kind of lonely Scots pine for a while. I sort of, you know, out on the hill on my own, I suppose, and just writing long solo books for years, really. And then around 2015, I suppose, 2014, partly when I was working on a book called Landmarks, which was in many ways a crowdsourced book of about the language that we possess or have forgotten for aspects of creaturely life and weather and nature and landscape. That drew me into conversations with many people, a sort of rhizome of conversations, gathering words that weren't mine, weren't theirs, but formed a word hoard, a communal word hoard that might allow us to speak more precisely, more lovingly, more reciprocally about the living world. And then since then, really, the last 7 years have been almost entirely collaborative. I mean, I published one big book, Underland, which is written by me, but is filled with other people's expertise and wisdom and encounters and so forth. But otherwise it's been collaboration, and I just love collaboration. I think that I just learned so much. To me, writing's just boring to watch, right? Nobody wants to watch a writer write. It's kind of occasionally licks the end of the pencil, kind of stares off into the middle distance, scratches the chin. It's not very dramatic. And whereas watching a musician make music is secular magic. Watching Jackie turn, as she says, kind of sleeping colour from a paint box made 100 years ago. She adds water that she gathered from a spring or the tap an hour ago, and then her brush is a dancer, and she brings creatures to life. So there's just a basic thrill, but then there's also this sense of conjunction and trust and shared expertises and a very dynamic form of creativity, which I find. It's taken me a little while to set aside my slightly micromanagerial tendencies, particularly when it comes to the language side of things, and realise that I have so much to learn from it. Jackie and I are so different in the way we look at the world, but she's so wise. She always says, I don't know, I never wanted to be a human, I wanted to be a bear. So I was kind of, what would a bear think here? So Jackie tells me. So yeah, it's a wonderful process. Tell me how it works within a professional setting within art therapy then? Is it trust again?
Often as an individual practitioner, like I run a private practice, I work on my own just with a client, so that's a very small communitas, just one-on-one. But then when you work with groups, it's larger, and I work as a lecturer, so that is for me one of the most wonderful things, to be in a room with, and I know you're a teacher as well, so you might have experienced it as well, or with mature students, where everyone brings in their wonderful life experiences and knowledge, just like you were saying, and different creativities, and what can be achieved, I think, with people coming together like this is so different than working on one's own. And just like you, I think I am the idea of a teacher managing a class or so, I had to learn to let it all flow, and the same with working with a client, the way that our therapists work. It's not so much in the old model of psychotherapies, where there is the very much directive therapist and the very much receiving client, but where both of them work together, and where both learn and explore and are creative at the same time, and how if that sometimes it flows, sometimes it doesn't, but when that works, it's just the most incredible experience for both people, or for the whole group, rather than just that for the therapist it's a job, and for the client it's a session. But no, there's something created in that space,
and when it's happening, don't you? You can feel it in the air. It's a very yes, teaching is, my definition of teaching is always thinking with. It's not what we would say the Gradgrindian model of sort of the student as the vessel to be filled with I really dislike lecturing on the whole, and the best forms of teaching in my experience are seminar or small group teaching, and then you become a little bit more perhaps like a conductor, where you're kind of, you've got a quiet violin in the back right corner, and you sort of want a little bit more noise from them, but you want the trumpets to be quieter down the front, generally boys.
There's always trumpets.
There's always trumpets. So the art becomes much more that of a kind of facilitator.
And do you ever experience this, just stick with the word communitas now, when you're in the living world, that things happen with you or between you and the living world, that you yourself, like with your writing, I suppose it's the same question nearly than the self and landscape, that where those two meet, and you were just talking about the space in between, that when it's happening. So is that when you go on the many journeys or the many explorations, is that what happens for you, that there is something happening?
Yes, I think, it's an old, people talk a lot about romanticism. I find romanticism broadly gets kind of very ahistorically reduced to a set of cliches, the single, the man astride the summit peak or whatever. And in fact, I would say that romanticism, if we're understanding it as a kind of extraordinary broth of ideas, revolutionary ideas about the self and its relationship to the world, that was fermented in the later 18th and early 19th century. Actually, it's much more to do with dissolving and dissolution, and a kind of gaseous being that is partakes of the world, and is made by the world than the idea of what Frederick Jameson calls the windless solitude of the monadic ego, which I think is so. There's a widespread literacy about what romanticism means, but also the version of romanticism that I'm much more interested in is the model of diffusion, of kind of conjoining. And occasionally, I do feel that I suppose I also think that so Sherwood Anderson, the American writer, has this lovely phrase. He talks about the feeling of the bigness outside ourselves, and I think there is a humility that comes from the encounter with what we were calling earlier, Bettina, kind of utter rock or utter sky, or that sort of full force wildness of geology, of time, of weather, of that is the bigness outside ourselves. I think that's valuably humbling to us, though of course it can be brutal and destructive. An earthquake is a reminder of the bigness outside ourselves. But I'm also interested in the difficulty of being reminded that we are animal. So again, it's something we discussed. I mean, it's very easy to say, oh yes, of course humans are animals like other animals, but actually everything, so much about the way we live and the way we're constructed as linguistic beings and consumer beings and citizen beings is committed to the idea that we aren't animal, that we are a part, that we are a kind of super species. And I think probably the most sort of valuable encounter I have in response to your question is where I'm suddenly reminded of just how kind of animal I am. I'm a bag of bones. I'm a creature moving through a world of other creatures, and I'm vulnerable and powerful in different measures. And there's something about that which is quite it's a hard thing to meet sometimes. There's a spell at the beginning of this book, The Lost Spells, it's about the red fox, and at the very end, the poem kind of turns on the reader and says, red is my fur, red is my art, and red is the blood of your animal heart. And suddenly what seems to have been a poem about the fox is suddenly the fox actually looking back at us and telling us that we are, we are fox, we are red, we have animal blood pumping through our animal hearts. And Jackie Morris meets that line with this incredible 2-page image of the fox's face up close, just staring back out at us, that sort of j'accuse of animal to animal. So yes, does that make some sort of sense?
Of course it all makes sense. And I think in your books, what is so beautiful is that you manage to talk both about your vulnerability when you're out there, but also about the moments of, I mean, you say glory of
wonder,
and experience, and of meeting, and also of the slogging and the hardship, and so there's everything. You cover everything. Your books are not books of heroes, of heroes' adventures. They are books of someone going out there and experiencing what comes towards you, and then sometimes that puts you in difficult situations, and other times it lifts your spirit, your heart, what you were saying.
There's a great Scots verb, to thole, Thole, which is to kind of endure hardship, to thole. And there's a very sort of faint, I guess, Calvinist Protestant hint to that Presbyterian hint to that you're made better by tholing. And there's the mountaineer in me, the sort of, you can take the boy out of the west coast of Scotland, but you can't take the west coast of Scotland out of the boy, or whatever. A little bit of me does quite like the tholing of the hills. And
it's terrible to read. I always think, oh my God, I'm so glad you did it. I could never do it. Which is, of course, the whole point. Why you write about this.
I do it so you don't have to.
I know.
Especially with the caving, but...
Cool. So, Robert, I just got a couple more, really. One question, and then, So, in art therapy, one of the first things in the course, in the postgraduate diploma, that we introduce students to is fairy tales and myths, and the importance of story. Because, of course, while as art therapists we use art a lot, but we use words and metaphor and imagery a lot also through words. And so, and the next question is about myth, and because myths have always been important to people forever, as soon as people could talk, and they help people to make sense of the world, provided guidance. And the writer Joseph Campbell, in his talk on the power of myth with Bill Moyer, says, the only myth that is worth thinking about now is talking about the planet. And he also says, for it is the artist who brings images of mythology to manifestation, and without images, whether mental or visual, there is no mythology. And so one of the books that you have written, a very slim book, but a very amazing book, is called Ness, which has a lot of poetic image-filled, a myth-like quality.
Yeah.
And you also have collaborated with the musician Johnny Flynn, which we've mentioned before, to write the album Lost in the Cedarwood, which is also based on the Epic of Gilgamesh. So do you think we need new myths? How will they look? Is that part of what you want to achieve with your writing? That, just what role does myth play for you? I don't know.
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. Joseph Campbell he was early to this idea that we sort of need new myths. I mean, on the one hand, the definition of a myth is its malleability and its remakeability. So in a sense, it's putty for the strongest hands, I suppose. And we've seen myths misused as well. Like a myth is not always a good myth. A story is not always turned to what I would call good ends. We need only to think of the way the Third Reich understood the power of old stories and old myths and could rehabilitate them, and the myth of the the Great Forest, and we all know these notions, and particularly nation builders and demagogues. They delve deep into what I think it was Philip Larkin calls the myth kitty, and they rummage around until they find something that
suits them,
that helps. So it's not. So it's sort of stories are neither good nor bad. Myths are neither evil nor holy. It's how they're used. But then the question of their power is indubitable to me. I mean, they are extraordinarily powerful. Narratives are extraordinarily powerful. Richard Powers famously, the most famous sentence, I think, from his incredibly widely read novel, The Overstory, is facts never changed a person's mind. The only thing that can do that is a good story. And he told us a new story in that, or a new old story in that novel, which is that of the wood wide web, of the mycorrhizal fungal network. And I've become fascinated by how attractive that story of the way trees notionally share resources with one another via this kind of other being that knits with their root tips and forms this hyphal mycorrhizal network of fungi that joins tree to tree and creates a sort of wood wide web of the forest. So that's an example perhaps of a myth which has a material basis, which nevertheless has become a metaphor, an enormously powerful metaphor that is drawing us to it as an example of good mutualism. And that kind of quick myth making, although as we've said, indigenous communities have known that forests think together and share resource together for a long time, is fascinating. The last thought about this, which is to do with Gilgamesh, which I was completing a long essay on for the New York Review of Books yesterday, because there's a big new translation has just come out by Sophus Heller, a young Danish Assyriologist. And as you know, Bettina, I'm particularly fascinated by this journey to the cedarwood that happens at the middle of Gilgamesh, which occupies 5 or 6 tablets of the 12, and which in the standard Babylonian version, and which actually has a version of itself in the oldest of the Gilgamesh sources, which is a Sumerian cycle of 5 stories that are sort of freestanding, and it's about ecocide. It's a story of ecocide. Gilgamesh and Enkidu go to this beautiful forest that is a place of harmony, that has a mind. They kill Humbaba, the life of the forest, the guardian spirit, forest demon, and then they unsustainably fell the forest, and they fell it all the way to the banks of Euphrates, and then they take the timber and they truck it out. I mean, it's just basically unsustainable modern ultra logging in action, and catastrophe follows. Enkidu is killed by the gods as punishment. Gilgamesh goes mad and leaves the city-state. Everything kind of falls apart. So it's such a clear warning. And yet here we are. Sophus Heller says, when he was reading from his Danish translation, because he did a Danish translation, in 2019 on tour, it was the time of the Amazon wildfires. That year was when, and he said people just began crying in the audience because of this resonance, very powerful resonance. And then when Johnny and I were making our album, it was the same time that the first protesters of now hundreds and thousands were gathering at another cedarwood, the cedarwood of Fairy Creek in Vancouver Island in northwest British Columbia, to be humbabas, to protect that forest. It's still ongoing, the process is still ongoing. So I suppose what I mean is that powerful myths warn us, but their destiny as warning seems to be to go unheeded as well. So here we are, 4,400 years on, repeating the same mistake. So that conclusion is not a hopeful one, I suppose. But tell me, how do you see positive use of myth? Do you see positive use of story in your work?
Yeah, well, definitely. One of the first things that the students do is that they find either a myth or a story that has an element of change, because every story has an element of change in it, otherwise it wouldn't be a story, and they apply it to something that has happened in their life where something has changed. So to find a resonance between those stories, and then they present it in a small film, and often to be able to look at what is happening within, and to find a resonance in something without, in a story, or but also in that way in nature, or in an art piece, can be an incredibly holding thing, not healing necessarily, but just to be able to connect to something out there, and to feel that you're not the only one that had this experience, that maybe in a myth or in a legend or old story, people have suffered.
Yes.
People have always suffered, or nature has suffered, and I'm suffering. And so there is this correlation that we are all part of this greater whole.
So is that a version of the communitas? It's that shared
I suppose
sense
so,
of
but yes,
trans-historical experience.
Yeah, so that would be one way, and sometimes just to look at other stories can really it can help you to rewrite your own story.
Yes.
By seeing what happens in other stories.
Because you see that selfhood is a kind of narrative that can be fashioned and self-fashioned, refashioned. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
And it's probably a bit too naive to say that you just got to tell yourself a different story and suddenly everything is different. It's not quite like that. But often what we do is we interpret our life in certain ways, the things that we have experienced. But that is very much through our own eyes and through our own experience. But then to hear stories where somebody has suffered, but the ending is different than my ending, then I can suddenly see an alternative. Or I can look back and think, yes, I have suffered, yes, I have lost somebody, but look what can arise out of this. I might not be able to see this, but if I see it in a story or in an art piece that I create, maybe even myself, then there is suddenly a different, an alternative to what I have so far always just clung on to, because I could not step out of myself enough. So that's often what...
That's absolutely fascinating, and a sort of it gives a clinical or therapeutic basis for something that writers and literary theorists or narratologists often say, or the plurality of possible pathways is itself a freeing sort of geometry or perception or topography, perhaps is a better word, but actually to know that does happen and that one steps outside of a fatalism, a constricting fatalism. And that you've seen that work. That's exciting.
And it the therapist is not the one that drives this.
No.
But it's the therapist can even just suggest that often people have become very small and narrow in their view of the world, because if one is not well, in whatever way, your horizon narrows, and it's very difficult to look outside of this. And in art therapy, through art or through movement or through dance or rhythm or through color, anything can happen that opens this horizon up a little bit again, and that can be really helpful. Yeah. Okay, Robert, the very last thing now. So in the very beginning of the training, we introduced the students to the ancestral line of art therapists, which connects to the shamans who use song and dance and rhythm for healing. We also connect to the earliest artists, which were the people who drew in caves. And you have a very moving passage in your book, Underland. And I wonder if you read from this.
Yeah, I can. Yeah, let me pull it out. So this is just a little bit of context for the listeners. So this is from a chapter called "The Red Dancers" in a book called Underland, and I was drawn to a very strong place in the landscape, which is a sea cave about 100 plus feet high at the entry point, deep. We're in the Lofoten Islands, which is just in the Arctic chain of islands coming off the North Norwegian coast. And this sea cave effectively looks almost out onto Kol Halaren, which is the huge maelstrom, a whirlpool that sits between the last of the Lofoten chain and a sort of outer-lying island. And so it's a place where the sea opens itself to its depths through the helix of the maelstrom, and it's a place where the sea has opened the mountain to its depths by the creation in many millennia ago of this sea cave. And into that place were drawn human beings, hunter-gatherers, peri-Arctic, effectively Bronze Age, itinerant peoples who were moving up and down that very, very hard coast, seeking food. So they lived marginal, but scarcely subsistence lives, but they still found time to make art. And at some level, they wish to. It's very difficult to speculate on cause and reason and affect now, but they left several thousand years ago petroglyphs, so there are quite a lot of carved rock art, but because of the nature of the climate up there, very little painted rock art survives. But where it does survive, in fact, is deep in this cave. The form of the rock art there, the painted rock art, is of a red dancer, quite simply painted, probably using a finger dipped in red iron oxide stained water. And I'd made a very difficult journey to get to this place. It had proved unexpectedly wintry and therefore perilous, and I was pretty exhausted and anxious, and it's a very wild place. There's nothing there. I mean, there's the coast and the Arctic Ocean. There's no mobile reception. There's nothing really apart from the elements and the human mark in the form of debris on the foreshore. So let me see if I can just read a little. I suppose I'll just read two passages, and
Sure.
then one is about the making of them, kind of imagination, and then the other is about my finding of them. A summer's night 3,000 years ago. At this latitude, in this season, darkness scarcely exists above ground. Low tide, calm sea. A small group of figures follows the shore, stepping from rock to rock. The cave's mouth is vast, and its lower lip sits close to the waterline. The figures pause at its threshold. The distant roar of the maelstrom, a sea eagle turns overhead, wingtips near the cliffs that drop sheer to the water, and the figures pass one by one into the cave, where the world changes. Colour thins out, yellow of the late sun ebbing, green is gone, grey rises, grey of the rock, streaked with brown, streaked with red, wet sand underfoot, white of the sand, black of the deeper shadows ahead, the smell of damp stone. 100 feet into the cliff, and the last full light falls on a pale central buttress of rock, around which the cave space splits. would be a good canvas, but it's too near the outer world of waves and eagles and time told in its usual ways. So the figures follow a teardrop rift, moving up between fallen stones, and here, in the shadows, space and time spill into one another. If life exists, it is the slow life of rock. It is the sea's patient exploration of the mountains inside. Up where the tunnel wall overhangs them, the figures halt and make their preparations. Rock is to be the painter of rock. In a cup of stone they crush hematite, mix it with spit and earth and rainwater to make a red paste, and the painting begins. Dip of a fingertip and a single sure red line moves across the pale slope of rock, curving down in an arc that echoes the chest and one leg of a figure that is dancing, a figure that is jumping. Dip again, reach, draw down in a curve to make the second leg of the dancing figure. Dip again, a crossed line for the outstretched arms, and on to the next figure. Dip, draw single sure red lines moving over the slope of the rock, filling the slope of the stone with red dancing figures. So that's how they were left, and then eventually I made it into that cave, this is what I found. The air here thrums, sounded by sea and wind driven into this hollow so that it turns upon itself. This space has been won by wave, by war. I take the left-hand rift, rising up and into the rock, yellow-white granite to the higher side, leaning away, and leaning over me now is a darker stone, streaked with red and black, broken and veined. I'm here at last, such a long, cold journey to reach this place. I rest against the rock behind me, let my eyes adjust to the shadow, look at the wall of granite ahead. But there are no figures on the stone. None at all. I look again, stare, search. There's nothing here. All this way, all these miles, and the dancers have vanished. Were they ever there at all? I lean back, right back against the rock behind, let the stone take my skull's weight, let the shadow settle into eyes that are tired of looking. And when I open my eyes and look again, there is, yes, there, the flicker of a line that is not only of the rock's making. The line is crossed by another and joined by a third, and there, yes, there is a red dancer, scarcely visible but unmistakable, a phantom red dancer leaping on the rock, and another here, a dozen or more of them, spectral still but present now, leaping and dancing on the rock, arms outstretched and legs wide, forms shifting and tensing as I blink. These figures are ghosts, all dancing together, and I am a ghost too, and there is a conviviality to them, to us, to the thousands of years for which they have been dancing here together, and suddenly, unexpectedly, my head begins to tingle and my back and my chest start to shake, and I find myself crying, sobs shuddering my body in the teardrop-shaped rift, far from another human and so close to these generous dancing figures. The dangers of the journey to reach the dancers ebb from me, the joy of their movement ebbs into me, and I cry there, surprised and helpless, deep in granite and darkness, weeping for feelings that I cannot name.
Thank you, Robert. And there is not much to say after this anymore. Just thank you for doing this. And farewell.
Oh, bless you, Bettina. It's a joy to talk with you. And as I was reading that, I suddenly felt how close it was to some of the things you talk about and think about and practice. And perhaps it echoes many of the things we've talked about in our conversation: communitas, the conviviality, and of weeping for feelings that one cannot name, and consolations, and also the menaces of the given world.
And for me, this has the dance described has a very ritualized feel to it.
Absolutely.
as well as the painting.
Yes.
And the mythical quality of it, also of you. In that way, that was a heroic journey, but you arriving there and then meeting those two worlds, because you also talk about the hand touching.
Yes.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank
we will
you.
finish this here.
Okay.
Thanks for listening. This podcast was produced by Hilary Tapper and Vic Segedin, music by Kathy Manning. A list of the books mentioned in this talk can be found on the JoCAT website. JoCAT is in the process of building up its podcast resource. If you have an idea for a podcast that would be of interest to other creative arts therapists, please get in touch through our website. You can listen to JoCAT podcasts through the JoCAT website or the JoCAT YouTube channel.